Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, an Australian blood donor who was rather unique has died at the age of 88, but only after more than 70 years of continuous donations of blood plasma. A case study of a carnivore diet causing strange yellow depositions on your skin. A woman with Down syndrome with Alzheimer's, but not with dementia, which is a bizarre instance. One of the world's most prevalent STIs may actually be also one of the most common regular infections. Fossil evidence of some of the oldest arms race in the world in terms of evolution. A woman has been arrested for making the organic produce too organic and natural. And finally, we have the ISS and hygiene. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with blood donations, one of the most essential things you can possibly do on a voluntary basis. Well, one of two. Technically speaking, a lot of blood banks have a lot of blood donors, but blood donors only come in every 12 weeks or thereabouts, so approximately 3 times a year, allowing for at least one period where you're ill or otherwise unavailable. The other option, of course, is plasma. Now, plasma can be given much more frequently. The frequency is going to vary somewhere between 2 weeks and 4 weeks. It depends a bit on just who you ask and where you are in the world. In Australia, it appears to be at least every 3 weeks, as an Australian man has shown. The importance of this man is not so much that he's a plasma donor. Rather, it's what's special about his plasma that makes him such a valuable donor and someone arguably highly regarded. After beginning to donate at the age of 18 after receiving a life-saving blood transfusion at 14, his plasma has been used to help with what's a condition called hemolytic disease in the newborn. Fundamentally, the mother carries a non-rhesus blood type and the baby carries a rhesus blood type. Because of this, the mother's immune system recognizes the baby as being foreign and starts to attack it in utero. This leads to spontaneous abortion, if things go very badly. The plasma that this guy had allows for that to be treated and essentially mitigate that immune response, at least to some extent. The key thing here is that these plasma donations, way back in the 60s, were the first of kind, not the very first, but one of, and as such, they allowed for injections that would allow a mother to carry a baby to full term without any of the complications that come with the immune system trying to attack it, leading to the loss of the baby. It isn't a small number either who would benefit from this treatment. Understand, about 20%, a little bit less, but let's say 20% to make the number easy, of women in Australia are at risk, and this figure isn't necessarily much different in other parts of the world, although a blood type varies drastically across different ethnic, geographical, and population groups in a very broad sense. In other essentially disease-related news, we have the flu and the fact that it continues to surge in the USA. USA is number one. USA is number one in something it doesn't want to be number one in. Sure, science is great, money is great, Hollywood movies is great. Flu, not so much. Especially since, well, it does lead to problems, particularly deaths. Since October last year, that's 2024, there have been between 16 and nearly 80,000 deaths from flu, and there have been up to nearly 750,000 hospitalizations and about 23 or so million medical visits. So this is not a small number, and the impact is significant. Now, on top of everything else we've mentioned, there are some pretty obvious issues, that largely just being it's preventable to some extent, but the problem is being prepared and actually using it, that being the vaccine. The problem is a lot of people are hesitant to use the flu vaccine for dumb reasons, and in other cases, there's just bad luck when it comes to predicting which particular influenza strain is going to be the relevant one, or 4 in many cases. Shifting to a series of case studies now, we have the weird results of a carnivore diet. A carnivore as in eating meat, not carnivore as in going to a circus, although theoretically you might see this person at a circus as something of a sideshow given that they are beginning to turn yellow like they've been eating cheese-flavoured chips and similar. Yeah, it was that orange, and the reality is going to be that this is probably a fairly predictable result, let's say. It's either going to be an excess of vitamin A or carotene. They're essentially the same thing, one becomes the other once it's metabolized in the body. But other than being a weird case study, it's also very reminiscent of an episode of House where he's working in the clinic, and as you can see...
What's that? What are you doing?
Painkillers.
Oh, for you, for your leg.
No, because they're yummy. You want one? Make your back feel better. Unfortunately, you have a deeper problem. Your wife is having an affair.
What?
You're orange, you moron. It's one thing for you not to notice, but if your wife hasn't picked up on the fact that her husband has changed color, she's just not paying attention. By the way, do you consume just a ridiculous amount of carrots and megadose vitamins? Carrots turn you yellow, the niacin turns you red. Find some figure paint and do the math. And get a good lawyer.
So yes, turning yellow means that this guy's probably going to be divorcing someone soon, because, well, they didn't notice it and they had to go to a doctor. But the other reason is also, well, being married to someone who looks like they've been constantly living with their hands inside of a chip bag is perhaps not necessarily the most appealing. Sadly though, the case this time wasn't due to vitamin A or carotene. Instead, it's due to lipids, and specifically cholesterol. The guy was adding roughly 4 kilograms, or roughly 9 to 10 pounds of fatty food to his diet every day, and this led to having ridiculously high cholesterol levels. 5 times what was considered healthy, somewhere around the range of 1 gram in every 10 litres, or 1,000 milligrams in a deciliter. That's really not good, and the reason he was turning yellow is, well, quite literally that cholesterol was coming out of his bloodstream because it was so built up in places and coming through his skin. He will now also have to live essentially for life with the mark of shame of having done something kinda dumb, because these stains effectively will not go away. They're almost like a tattoo in some respects. The only way to really remove them is basically surgery, and it involves lasers, which could be considered fun. On the other end of the sex spectrum, we have a woman developing kidney injuries from a menstrual cup. Yeah, the case studies this week do get stranger, and this is not the weirdest yet, so hold on. What happened was very simple. The menstrual cups are basically meant to act very similar in a way to basically a pad or a tampon. Slightly more environmentally friendly, but the same basic concept. However, they need to be fitted very carefully, because if they're not the right shape and size, well, you get leakage, and not only is that embarrassing for the individual, but it does carry certain risks. Now, there are obvious issues around biological contamination and therefore infection or similar, but that isn't the case here. Instead, it's rather more bizarre, let's say. The young woman was in her 30s, so she's more or less in the prime age where this would more or less be a fairly significant concern. What they found was that over 6 months they developed, symptoms of injury. Mostly things like blood in urine and pain in their abdomen. Things that are fairly typically associated with issues around, say, a UTI or similar. But scanning their abdomen found that their right kidney and the ureter going into it had problems. That the menstrual cup that they had been using, it was pushing up against the ureter opening and compressing it, thereby preventing the kidney from passing the, effectively urine at that point, down and into the bladder. A kind of an important function. You want to move things from the kidney to the bladder so you can pee them away. Otherwise, they don't go anywhere and they cause damage. The good news is that treatment's actually quite simple. Stop using the menstrual cup, and after about a month, the symptoms had drastically improved. The swelling went down, and the, essentially, obstruction had prevented itself from, well, being an obstruction anymore by not being used. The last case study we have for you is one that's truly bizarre and involves another young woman. It's a US woman with Down syndrome who, although having Down syndrome, which is entirely a chromosome-related condition, had Alzheimer's, but although having Alzheimer's, didn't have dementia. Now, typically speaking, the two will go hand in hand. Generally speaking, one is related to all the effects of the other, so if you get brain injuries from Alzheimer's, you tend to have dementia occurring, which is pretty obvious. But in this case, although brain function decreased over time, memory was not affected. This meant they had the physical symptoms, at least in terms of what's going on in their brain, but none of the expected symptoms of it. This is where things get really weird. It's Kind of like putting the cart before the horse, but obviously that's not what's happened here. Mostly because someone with Alzheimer's disease wouldn't remember which way the horse and the cart goes. It is worth remembering, but to be clear about this, it is a case study and essentially a one-off isolated incident. It's very unlikely to necessarily be replicated anywhere and in anything else. But it does identify certain pathways that might be, and it's a very large might, be worth exploring, particularly with regards to things like Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Next we move on to purely cosmetic medical news, and it's the risk of cancer and getting a tattoo. Now, there's been on and off arguments for quite a while now that getting a tattoo increases your risk of cancer, and okay, there is some rationale to that. Basically speaking, the process of getting a tattoo causes damage across a wide swath of your skin. Now, you can argue how much is considered a wide swath, but either way, it causes inflammation, and inflammation can then contribute to things like cancer. This is why certain autoimmune diseases, like say Crohn's disease, celiac, and similar, have a higher risk of things like digestive or GI tract cancers because of how the body works and responds to the antigen on things like say gluten, or the gluten being an antigen. In this case, however, getting a tattoo should mostly be a one-off. After all, you go in, you get your tattoo done. Sure, it might be over a few sessions, but at the end of that should be it. But the long time frame in which tattoo heals that is largely unnoticed could be contributing to it in a different way, and this is where a twin study is useful. The southern Denmark study was looking at twins, basically those who did and didn't have tattoos. Now, the key thing here is, did the twins have cancer as well? And they found that if there was a twin with cancer and tattoos, they had a much higher risk of, cancer. Obviously enough, it would be kind of silly if they didn't. Now, the case control group was much smaller. Their study group had about 2,300 people, and their control group was about 316, so you have to take this with a lot of salt. Further, there is at least some argument that can be made very well here for a dose response. That is, the larger the tattoo, the more likely cancer is to develop. Smaller than a palm, and you could arguably say that it's somewhere between a 33 and 62% greater risk of developing cancer. Bigger than a palm, and now it's 3 times, and obviously that does leave a lot of space in between based on the size of the tattoo. There's also some further questions that do need to be asked, particularly about the predisposition of individuals already to things like cancer, as certain cancers are more prevalent in certain groups, or what kind of cancer specifically they were looking at, and is it just something like, say, skin cancer, and specifically what type of skin cancer, as the skin is rather complex, and finally, whether or not the actual dyes and processes used affect this. After all, not all cosmetic dyes used in tattoos are necessarily the most healthy or beneficial, let's say, and certainly in some instances they're just outright not allowed, but they're allowed because tattoos. And moving on to STIs, and no, we're not talking about babies again, we've been through that already at the start. No, instead this time we're talking about infections in STI, and specifically bacterial vaginosis. Essentially it's when bacteria colonize someone's vagina and, displace the naturally existing species there and create issues. Burning, itching, discharge, and similar. Essentially all the things you don't want to have happen. And not just is it you don't want to happen because of the pain, discomfort, and, if depending on how you look at this, lack of sex, but more that it can have more significant implications over a much longer time frame. For example, there are issues around fertility, premature birth, low birth weight for infants, and more. All of these could be more significant depending on how you look at having children in the future. A possibility or a pipe dream. But ignoring that issue for now. The Australian research is looking at whether or not the concern itself is not only significant, but whether or not we should really be considering it not just an STI, but the leading STI. This would in turn displace things like, say, chlamydia, which affects about 1 in 5 women, at least in the United States. In America, we don't measure it that way. We measure it in koalas, because koalas are all horny little sex pests who all have chlamydia. A lot of them do, which, given this is Australian research, presumably that is how they measure it. One thing you would struggle doing with koalas that you do with this research is that rather than just treating the woman in this case, it's both the male and female partner that need to be treated. At the moment, it's really only the female who gets treatment. The males may, and that's a very big may, get an oral antibiotic, but they don't get a topical antibiotic, whereas females get both. By doing that, that is the male and female partner both get it, they get significantly better results. Of course, we are always skeptical about any research that calls for greater prescription of antibiotics. Going on to purely biological research now, but this time looking at single cells and the ability to encode data in them and use them as a means of transmitting that data. Understand, this is not conspiracy nonsense. This is actually something that could theoretically work. It's not like the crazy nutters who think that they're putting something into the COVID vaccines. This actually looks at the idea of using tiny single cells as a way of streaming FM data. Now, this is, understand, very preliminary, very small scale, and very, very niche in its application at the moment. But for now, if we just move on to the actual significance of it, well, things get fairly straightforward. That is, the ability to be able to use cell functions to create tiny little synthetic protein oscillators that can then transmit could allow us to, say, create ways of identifying location of cancer, allowing for the use of, say, biological systems in computing and similar. Something like implantable devices that allow for the response and reading of what's going on in your body and then responding accordingly, such as, say, an insulin pump. The catch with all this, though, is that yes, we can make them, yes, they work, but they require machine learning to not only analyze and learn what the cells are trying to tell us, but to then translate what they've said and then apply it in a way that a human can understand. This is the challenge, and one reason why this is very small scale, very niche, and rather unique. You simply don't have the means of being able to do this on a large enough scale for it to be useful just yet. On the topic of tiny, we have the arms race found in fossilized shells. And we're talking about tiny in terms of the ability to put small holes in very tiny shells that have been fossilized, and that's one reason why they were fossilized, showing the development of weapons and defenses between two species. There's the early lamp shell relative called Lapwortha fasciata, and that was also found in Australia, which means that Australia's learning a lot about terrifying things lately. Let's just hope the emus don't learn about this, because if they figure out how to make better weapons, Australia might lose another war. Less facetiously, the fossils, when you put them up in a nice timeline showing their age, basically from the youngest to the oldest, the shells all have more or less exactly the same puncture. That's the side on which the predator more or less killed them. But what's important is that rather than just being the same side across the board, you also see that the thickness of that wall of the shell gets increasingly dense and thick. This means that there was an increasing attempt for these shells, or at least the creatures making them, to defend themselves from that same predator. Then, you see at a certain point, the rate at which the shells thicken sort of plateaus, but then the species that's predating on them suddenly starts puncturing the shells again, and then the shells start getting thicker. And so you can see a practical and real-world example of not just evolution, but an attempt to resist predation and the weapons of the said predator with better defenses. In rather more modern terms, we have, narwhals effectively jousting in a somewhat a viral drone footage. And yeah, that's basically what they appear to be doing. You can see a pair of narwhals in a recent video that's been going viral, butting against each other, although, fortunately or unfortunately, are completely missing each other with their massive horns. We say fortunately or unfortunately depending on how you want to look at this. In reality, a long narwhal tusk, for all intents and purposes, isn't what you would typically think of as a tusk. That is, it is essentially a hollow cone. Very much like snail cones, except in this case, they're not. Well, they could be, but they'd be sea snails, and they're honestly a little more terrifying. Nonetheless, because they are hollow, they are rather fragile, and because of that, you start smashing them together, they will break. The narwhal's tusk, horn, however you wish to look at it, is also, for all intents and purposes, the narwhal equivalent of a sports car. it's a penis-enhancing piece. Females prefer males with longer tusks, the same way you can make an arguable case that females prefer males with fast cars. Or large followings such as Tate, but Tate seems to be a particularly weird one where you might not want to follow his advice if you prefer to be on the good side of the law. On the bad side of the law, we have New Hampshire and a woman arrested after they made the natural produce all the more organic and natural by peeing on it. Yeah. Yeah, America. You are the gift that keeps on giving, but honestly, sometimes the desperation just to say, no, that's enough, comes to mind. The 23-year-old has not only urinated in all this produce, but recorded themselves doing so and uploaded it to social media. Not just have they uploaded it to social media, but they've done it more than once. So clearly, we are not talking about the cream of the crop here, or however the equivalent works for urination. The scum at the top of the UTI? Anyway, the phenomena has led to a mass recall of various contaminated items, and possibly even more items again once they figure out what else has been contaminated. Sadly, although arrested and charged with criminal mischief, they're not going to be charged until April. We strongly suspect that there'll be a settlement well before then. Next we have material news that's, well, actually material news, but it's the ability to impart a certain memory in some materials, but importantly, imparting memory in ways that's somewhat atypical, at least unusual. There has been past research that we've shown where, say for example, the pasta origami robots, where they would essentially self-assemble in some particular form. By having that, it's all well and good, it would work, but it's not necessarily the most useful, and well, it's pasta, it kinda doesn't last for very long. It either gets eaten or thrown away, and even if you try and somehow preserve it, well, things might still not work that well. What they're instead looking at here is the ability to essentially return to a previous point where it was already in that shape, rather than just forming a new shape and ideally permanently doing so. The key, let's say, underlying thing here is that you don't just have it forming that particular shape and then unforming itself. Instead, it can go through a series of steps where each successive step forces it to more or less trigger the next stage of whatever it's trying to form. Much like the process of folding an origami, except rather than having it done by hand, each of the folds forces the other folds to start happening of their own accord. This, of course, is very much reliant on computer stimulation and models, so it's not necessarily perfect yet, but it does appear like it should work. The main reason it should in theory work is that by having it set up in such a way that forming these first folds causes others to go into a high energy state, and because those high energy states now exist, naturally the structure tries to adhere to whatever's going to become a low energy state. That would be forming the fold or moving in the particular way. That in turn then causes more high energy states elsewhere. You're essentially trying to shuffle around the energy inside of this structure to make it work in a particular way until you have everything you want, and then suddenly there should ideally be no more energy, but, well, wishes and horses beggars would ride. Or we'd all eat horse steak, take your pick. Next we go to outer space, and rather than looking at, well, things that are kind of cool technology-wise, we're going back into the gutter with the disgusting things, and it's how the ISS has a hygiene problem. And no, not a poop floating in space, which arguably could be a concern, as, strangely enough, NASA has managed to sort that issue out quite a while ago. Instead, the concern is that, well, astronauts on board are likely to be suffering from, essentially, exposure to every other astronaut's nastiness. This has led to extremely aggressive housekeeping, using a lot of sanitizing and sterilizing agents. And that's one of the things the researchers were looking at. Just what exactly do you have spread across the ISS? And they had a whole bunch of swabs and a whole bunch of surveys to figure this out, along with populating petri plates until they could figure out what was growing where. The key thing they found was that because the environment is so sterile, you actually, to some extent, wanted to have nastiness from humanity on board, and particularly from Earth as well. To a certain extent, microbes need to be part of our environment unless you're a bubble boy, in which case you definitely don't want that. But everybody else, yeah, you certainly want a at least limited amount of microbes spread throughout whatever environment you're in. And that's for a very simple reason. They help to maintain your immune system, they need to be eaten, they need to do all sorts of things to keep you healthy. If they're not there, well, you're going to have some problems. Sure, you don't need to be sitting in a pile of your own poop, but you do want some. The final news item we have for you this week takes you as far away from Earth as we're likely to get in the near future. That is the Moon. It is the intuitive machine that's about to land. This is the most recent return to the Moon in terms of USA. China, Japan, and a few others have all made recent attempts. Some more successfully than others, and some very unsuccessfully. The key thing here is that it's a private moon landing, which is weird. Just about every other effort to date, barring possibly one or two, have been government-run, let's say, services, similar to NASA, Japan's Aerospace Agency, the European Aerospace Agency, and similar. All of these have had the same point, that is, governments gave them a lot of money to achieve it. Well, this is privately run, and it intends to land somewhere roughly on the Moon. Roughly being the polite way of putting this, depending on what happens. If it lands well, we'll know exactly where it is. If it doesn't land well, things are going to be very unfortunate, and as of the 6th of March, we're not yet sure exactly what way it's going to go. The efforts are not just to get a rover on the Moon, though. The lander is all well and good, but it does more than that. They're trying to land Athena, which is the essentially carrier, and on Athena you'll find that there are 3 rovers and a rather interesting drone, and each of these will have its own particular job to do. Some are there to try and see what we haven't seen before, because massive great big craters. Others are going to be far more aggressive in what they get up to. For example, some are going to be drilling on the Moon. Some are going to be trying to send out signals to see just how much we can get communication going out there, and ideally how we can integrate communication from these rovers into astronaut suits. So now we just have to wait and see if they stick the landing. If they do, great. We'll have a bunch of new information and it'll be all sorts of interesting. If it's like last time, it's going to basically land badly, tip over, and that'll be the end of it. Which is a rather sad ending for something that's both cool and ridiculously expensive. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.